This week on Inside Olympia. Water is an increasingly precious commodity. How is Washington State managing water resources in areas like the Columbia River Basin, where demand outstrips supply? And as drought becomes more common, how is the state preparing for current and future dry spells? On the program, Tom Tebb, the recently retired director of the Office of Columbia River at the Department of Ecology, and Caroline Mellor, the statewide drought lead at Ecology.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. As the climate changes, as snowpack falls, and as demand for water increases, the state of Washington faces an uncertain future when it comes to access to adequate water. For the third year in a row, the state faces drought conditions in multiple counties. In our second half, we'll talk with the state's lead person on drought and find out more about the short-term and long-range forecast. But first, for 20 years, Tom Tebb worked on water resource management issues at the Washington Department of Ecology, his last 10 as the head of the Office of Columbia River. Tebb retired in February and took with him decades of institutional memory and experience working to manage a resource that is increasingly in short supply. He joins me now for a post-exit interview to talk about the lessons learned and what he hopes to pass along to water managers going forward. Tom Tebb, welcome to the program. Congratulations on your retirement. Thanks for coming out of retirement to do this interview.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
I should note that you were with the Department of Ecology for a 30-plus year career.
Yes.
You were telling me before we started the program that you worked on Hanford issues.
I did. That's where I started in 1992 when the Tri-Party Agreement was signed.
And the Tri-Party Agreement, remind us, state, feds, tribes?
State, feds, and the state of Washington.
So that's two.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
So yes,
the feds?
EPA,
Yeah.
the Department of Energy, and the Department of Ecology.
Got it. And this was about how to clean up Hanford.
Yeah, it was a long-term strategy to develop essentially milestones that would begin to address the historic and legacy problems of plutonium production out at Hanford.
It does lead us to water because one of the concerns, of course, is that the leaking tank waste, at least, could reach the Columbia River and contaminate it. So that was where you started, and then you made a transition into water resources.
Yes, I transitioned into what would we call our Shoreline and Environmental Assistance Program, and I managed actually both the Spokane office and the Acma office, so I was able to work in shorelands all across eastern and central Washington and really got a flavor for some of the complexities around shorelands as well as the water resource and water quality issues that the state faces.
So as we talk today, and you reflect on a 30-plus career with the state, 20-plus years working around water resources and management and protection of those resources, and in some ways there's scarcity or increasing scarcity. Let's just have a top-level, set the stage kind of conversation here for a moment. On the west side of the Cascades, we often call it the wet side, we tend to think, well, there's a lot of rain, and we're lucky in that sense, and we shouldn't have or we don't have a shortage. We think of east of the mountains as being drier, where there is more scarcity. But we also know the climate is changing, the snowpack is diminishing, and that increasingly we are seeing drought emergencies and concerns on both sides of the Cascade. So as you sit here now, how would you be thinking about, how should we be thinking about the state, west and east, when it comes to water?
I think in a lot of ways that there's some similarities. I think in most of eastern central Washington, we've over-appropriated what water resources were there.
So there's too little water, too much need.
Correct. Thank you for correcting me.
Well, no, I like the over-appropriation term, too, because that is the term of art.
Correct. And I think similarly, with population growth, as well as the issues that we're seeing around salmonids and salmon in our state, we're seeing similar problems in western Washington as well. I think areas like the Nooksack, other areas, Nisqually, are also experiencing this huge growth, as well as the challenge of trying to provide water for existing resources, both in the aquatic environment, but also for the communities and cities and the tribal nations that this water resources supports.
when you think about water as a resource, and it's so vital for people, for fish, for farms, and we know that, for instance, the states that rely on the Colorado River are constantly trying, that's also over appropriated, but that's the Southwest and California we sort of associate more with drought and with limited water resources and conservation. What is the state of play in our state right now? How should we be thinking about the value of water and how precious it is?
Oh, it is extremely precious, and I think that we have been blessed with an abundant amount of water, but we need to use it wisely. We need to be thinking about how we're using it. In historic senses, we used water to irrigate our farms and bring water to our communities. And much of that infrastructure, if you will, is aging. It's in a situation where there's opportunities to actually increase the availability of water with the same amount of water by conserving and using less and using it more efficiently. And I really think that is where I think the future is making these infrastructure investments, making them more efficient, making them more precise. Much of the eastern and central Washington developed with East Slope Cascade sort of irrigation systems, with the exception of the Columbia Basin system and the Yakima. Those were developed largely by the Bureau of Reclamation at the turn of the century. But even those facilities themselves are in need of significant investment to even keep what we have. And so what we've been trying to do during my tenure was to try to keep what we have, not grow it, not expand agriculture, but to make it more efficient and make it more value added in terms of how we use the water and where we use it and when we use it. I think there was a time when the water itself would be essentially provided onto the ground through what we call rill irrigation, essentially through a ditch that would go through the field and would essentially exit the field, what we'd call tailwater. Where now we have situations where we're using drip irrigation and there is no tailwater, there is no excess water, and we're being very precise about where we apply that water. I think there's more opportunity to do that at the scale that we're looking at in both in eastern and western Washington.
When you talk about the infrastructure that is reaching end of life, are we losing a lot of water out of that infrastructure, just leakage?
Just by its very nature, much of the irrigation systems are gravity fed. So if you would lose a particular portion of an irrigation system, you would need a place to waste, or what they call wasteways, an opportunity to release that water in a safe and managed way. Mm-hmm. Once you start to use more modern infrastructure with pipes and things of that sort, you're able to actually control that flow much more effectively and efficiently, as opposed to the gravity systems that are really, you saw in ancient Egypt,
Sure,
for that matter,
right.
in the Roman
Yeah.
times.
The aqueducts.
Correct.
I asked about leakage. I should also just ask about evaporation. I mean, I've seen those culverts and
Open
sort of
canals.
open canal distribution systems in eastern Washington. They're pretty common, but they are exposed and open to the sun. And you described sort of a more modern system that might be more pipe-based.
Correct.
Is evaporation?
It continues
issue?
to be an issue. What we're seeing when we do what we call tight line or pipe a system, we're seeing actually a savings of water. And in one case, in the Icicle Valley, we're working with the Cascade Orchards Irrigation
Is that
District.
sort of in the Leavenworth area?
Yes, that's in the Leavenworth area. And they were part of a bifurcation process where they essentially shared a diversion with the Leavenworth National Fish Hatchery that was established back in the 40s. We were actually able to sort of separate that diversion that shared that, and we actually were able to move Cascade Orchards irrigation's diversion downstream save a bunch of water between where it was diverted originally to where it now comes out, and then use a modern pump system to move it up into the farmland where it needs to be. Much more efficient, and because we were able to bring public dollars to that project, we got quite a bit of water back in stream for fish. And so that's really where I think, we're trying to find, well, what do people need? But what can we use with modern infrastructure and modern techniques today to put water back into the stream?
I mean, certainly we're seeing in agriculture the ability to use GPS, and I imagine AI is starting to be used to be much more precise in
Correct.
how planting happens and harvest happens. And so along those same lines, you're describing kind of technology being brought to bear in terms of managing water. I do wonder, though, where does the money come from to invest and build in this modern water infrastructure?
Yeah, and it continues to be a challenge. And I think as we've been watching this legislative session, in this particular environment where we have a budget deficit, trying to continue to make these investments can be a challenge. But I think it's just as important as our freeways, just as important as our other infrastructure, whether that be for wastewater or for stormwater. Water for farms and crops is really part of our state's economy. It supports our ports and supports a lot of our citizenry, if you will, on both sides of the state.
How would you say and we're going to talk in a moment about the Office of Columbia River and sort of your work there, but as you think and reflect on your career, how did your approach evolve when it came to balancing those competing needs, farming, fish, habitat, people, urban, rural?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it evolved from a regulatory, a no kind of answer to, well, let's think about this. Let's not try to unpack the situation. Let's understand sort of the nature or what we call the attributes of the water rights that are at play here. Because once we do that, I think we can find those opportunities for solution. That evolved with time. I think our prior posture was, well, there's water for everybody, and so we wrote a lot of water rights. And then there was a period of time where there is no more water.
We're over-appropriated.
And so, and now we need to be regulators.
So now you're saying no.
Now we're saying no. And I think...
And now you're saying, let's find a way.
Exactly. I think we're saying, let's be creative, let's be thoughtful, let's look at the attributes of the water right. Let's look at what you actually need versus what you want, and maybe we can find a solution.
How does the way that water rights work and senior appropriations, and if you lose it, if you don't use it, you lose it, fit into this? Because it seems like in some respects, water law has disincentivized conservation.
Yeah, it's a unique situation. Again, the water code for surface water was established in 1917, so you can think about sort of the era of that period. Our groundwater code, and I'm very proud of the fact that the state of Washington has a groundwater code, was developed in the 1940s, 1945. What we saw with the Relinquishment Act, which is a component of the water code, of the surface water code, which was established, I think, around 1967, as a result of some issues in the Yakima Valley, the idea around that whole concept was if you weren't using that water, it would go sort of into the public trust and then be made available to the next person in line. But because we had sort of given out so much water prior to that, really what we had was a deficit situation where we were trying to put water back into streams to support the aquatic environment that we were degrading. And so while the notion of trying to put that water back into the public trust for the next person in line, really we needed to recognize that next, quote, person was really the environment, was really the aquatic environment that we needed to sort of reestablish in many cases like the Yakima. And that's what I think what happens then is people feel like, well, if I'm not using the full, quantity in their water right, what's on paper, they're somehow, losing out. And I would argue that we're not trying to take anything from anybody. We're trying to make sure if you want to grow crops, you have the water you need, but not in excess and not at the detriment of our aquatic environment.
You talked about how the approach as regulators evolved and changed. How has the changing climate affected this work?
I think it's accelerated the challenge. I think it's accelerated not only the need to regulate, but I think it's also, we've recognized that we've built essentially a paradigm that's very fragile around agriculture that depended upon snowpack. And snowpack is really our reservoir for the state. It comes off slowly and provides those late season flows for, August, September, October, when our streams are mostly at their lowest. That snowpack would provide that extra water essentially to get us through the next season. With the loss of snowpack, what we've seen over the last decade or two is that we're seeing droughts more common. We're seeing what we would say is more rain and less snow. And that makes it challenging when we only have a limited amount of storage in a physical sense, like a reservoir. We counted on that snowpack essentially as a reservoir for much of the state, and now that we're seeing that we don't have that snowpack, the challenge is how do you manage that new environment?
There has been, over the years, discussion about more storage. I know it's expensive to build, and it's controversial in terms of whether that's the best use of funds. But what is your view and thought on whether we should be building a lot more storage capacity to account for the fact that we may not be able to rely on snowpack?
I think storage has a place in time, and I think also storage integrated with other solutions, whether that be in the terms of storage underground or what we would say aquifer storage, or maybe even smaller storage locations throughout a watershed that are sort of strategically located, as opposed to the large, big reservoir that maybe traditionally, we would think of. And so I think it's an integrated solution looking at multiple ways to sort of slow the water down, keep it in the watershed as long as we can, but doing that in a way that's cost effective.
Let's transition to the Columbia River system and your work
Sure.
as the lead of the Columbia River office. What should we understand about, that's a vast system, and then kind of within that there are
Subbasins.
subbasins,
Yep.
yeah. The tribes factor in here, Canada factors in. So when you're running that office, help us understand the geography, but also the scope of kind of responsibility.
Yeah, so the scope of responsibility was really kind of outlined in the enabling legislation that was established in 2006, and it really had us focus on problems that were present. Things like the Odessa aquifer depletion, lack of the ability of water rights on the main stem Columbia. Those water rights that were issued were interruptible for the last decade or so, how to fix that problem. So there was a specific list of things that were given to us to sort of look at and to address. But as we worked with what we call the Columbia River Policy Advisory Group, they said, well, widen your scope. The Columbia is the entire basin, and it's not just the Columbia River. And so we were given advice and guidance and support to look at individual basins as well as the main stem itself. We've made some great progress, but there's a lot more to do. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done out in the Odessa. We've made some significant advancements.
I'm interested because I was out there years ago for public radio doing a story about the aquifer drying up. This was an area that the canals had not reached during the so-called reclamation era when they were building all of the pipelines and ways to funnel water from the Columbia. So they were reliant on the aquifer. It was drying up. Wells weren't, they couldn't drill deep enough to find water. So bring me up to speed. What is some of the mitigation work that's happened out there?
So just to kind of put that in context, we provided them water rights with the notion that the second half of the Columbia Basin project would be built.
Eventually.
Yeah. So I think, recognizing that it took decades to really build what we have now, there was always an assumption that someday the second half would be built. Now, I'm not sure that will happen in my lifetime.
And certainly not in time for those farmers
No,
who were
exactly.
whose wells were going
So
dry.
that's what came to be what we call, the Odessa Special Study Area, which is how we had developed this idea of widening the existing canal, East Low Canal, widening that, and then developing a series of pumping plants that actually, although it's hard to tell, pump water uphill to those locations where those wells and farms are. And we've been able to put online 10,500 acres for what's called the East Low 47.5 system, and about another 8,500 acres on the very bottom of the system. And then we have another 16,500 acres that are sort of in the queue, ready to go. So we've got a little over 20,000 acres already replaced, essentially, out of the 87,700. So we've got some more work to do, obviously. This next big chunk,
So it's like a quarter of the need.
yeah, maybe a little over a quarter. And I think this next big chunk will move us closer to half.
So the other sort of thought or the word that's in my brain is adjudication, and the idea of adjudicating, I guess, mostly these subbasins. And if I'm remembering correctly, didn't it take decades to do the Yakima Basin?
Yeah, it started in 1977, and it didn't finish, I think, until 2020. So almost 40 years.
So that doesn't seem super efficient, and there's a lot more adjudication that needs to happen in this state. So again, with the lens of your experience, but also as you think about handing off the baton, what are some lessons learned there, and are there ways to speed up what has maybe historically, not in all cases, but in that case, been a multi-decadal
Yeah.
adjudication process?
And I really appreciate the question, and I really want to give a shout out to our Water Resources Program in the Department of Ecology, because they've given that question some good thought.
And by the way, we should probably also define what adjudication.
Yes. So an adjudication essentially established through a court who has a legal right to the water and who doesn't.
And this is going to happen in areas that are
Over-appropriated, where you have people sort of competing for the same resource. Essentially, Western water law, the foundation of that is first in time, first in right. So if I'm ahead of you in line, then I get my full share and you get what's left over, okay? It creates a system of winners and losers, unfortunately. And that was what the challenge was in the Yakima, and why
Because
it took
if you
so long.
have water, you probably don't even want to go through an adjudication process. If you don't have it, you're probably dying for that to happen.
Well, you do, because you want to be able to demonstrate that you have water legally. It doesn't, the department can't say you have water. It's the courts that ultimately decide.
So it
who
might be
has
a
the
way to
water right.
protect your
Correct. And I
But
think,
you're also, again, trying to figure out in an environment of scarcity, how can we stretch this water?
and I think that's where problem-solving, solutions, getting people at the table that are all competing over this resource and asking, those who may have it, what do you really need versus what do you think you want? And I think that's really getting to this notion of what we're seeing in the Yakima, and what we're starting in the Walla Walla Basin, and also in the Icicle, where we look at integrated resource solutions, where everyone says, I need this or I need that, and then we work together to develop a strategy to
So what are
accomplish
some
that.
strategies for speeding these adjudications up?
Well, I think some of the strategies are going to be automation. I think there'll be some working with the courts to make sure that they have adequate resources to be able to process essentially all of the claims and other demands that will come through the court system itself. A lot of digitation. We're digitizing the water rights themselves that are actually pieces of paper and moving them into a more modern form. So you'll be seeing a lot of that, as well as I think a more rapid review of those water rights than maybe what you had historically. There was a lot of precedent legal cases that were determined in the Yakima Aquavella adjudication that I think have sort of set the stage for future adjudications.
Do you have a sense of what's on the horizon in terms of adjudications? You mentioned a couple, but sort of what the 10, 20, 30-year horizon line looks like?
Well, I'm retired, so I'm not sure where the department's headed, but when I was there, we were looking at a couple of areas. We were looking, of course, in the upper Columbia River as an area to be adjudicated. We were asked by the Spokane tribe to address that issue. And so we're looking at that. We were looking at the Walla Walla Basin to re-adjudicate that basin that was adjudicated in the 30s. And then also the Spokane area. I think we were looking at the Rathdrum Aquifer area and some of the challenges there. But the Nooksack was number one of that list. And I think that's why we said, we really need to focus there.
I want to ask you about the role of sort of the importance of salmon recovery and how that's brought to bear on some of these decisions. And then that also sort of, by its very nature, brings in the tribes and their voice, and sort of historically how much of a voice tribes in this state have had and how much of a voice they have now and how that's evolved.
Well, I think it's evolved tremendously in terms of the tribes' rights, their treaty rights that were established are really kind of being recognized in a more formal way through the court system. And so as tribes, they have sort of the first right for their reservation, for their people, for their first-in-time rights for their fish, usual and custom, and all of those sorts of things. So I think with trying to balance what we did with agriculture and community growth with tribal rights, I think we're seeing those challenges kind of manifest themselves in whether they be court proceedings, whether they be an adjudication in the Nooksack, for example, or whether they be through litigation in a variety of different ways.
I can imagine, though, that there's going to be voices saying, look, there isn't enough water. Something's going to have to give. It's nice to think that we could perhaps be more efficient in how we distribute what water we have through some of these modernization techniques that you've described. But at the end of the day, if we're going to honor treaty rights and if we're going to save the salmon, we're going to have to say no to other uses. What's your reality check there?
Well, I think my reality check is the fact that we need to honor the commitments that we have made as a people, and that we do what we can during our moments of time of the ability to affect change or in positions of power, whatever they may be. And I think, if you will, the circle is coming back, I think, to some of the tribal issues that may have not been addressed early on in the development of this state, on the development of agriculture and other things, and I think they're being addressed now. Will there come a day when we have to make those tough choices? Absolutely. I'm on a bit of the optimist side, that I'm thinking that we can still squeeze more out of what we have to kind of meet today's demands, as well as those commitments that we made as a people to those tribes.
Sticking with the Columbia Basin for a moment, how much, again, because of climate change and because water is a diminishing resource, do you anticipate sort of a radical evolution of the kinds of crops we're growing and looking for more drought-tolerant crops and figuring out ways, are we going to start growing crops that we typically saw grown in California up here?
I think that's entirely possible. I think there's already been a movement of some tomato processors and some looking at what's being grown in the Central Valley as to whether it could be grown in the Columbia Basin. I think that's entirely possible. We have some incredibly vibrant and healthy soils and clean, clear water. So I do think there's an opportunity there. I also believe that as we move forward through time, trying to find what kinds of crops we should be growing. That question of, is one beneficial use higher than another? We have not crossed that threshold as a state yet. We might in the future. Is one crop less important than another? I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe the water code was set up that way. But eventually, I think there may come a time when we may have to make those choices about, is an apple better than a pasture? Is a pasture better than, corn? Vice versa. And those are tough choices because these are people's livelihoods, right? They've made their living or their farm or their community based on some of these crops. And I think as we transition, and agriculture will transition, as we transition, we will hopefully keep the water resources in mind as we do that.
What are the lessons for the west side of the Cascades, for the wet side?
I think the lessons are that water is scarce, that the fact that it is very green here, and it is also rains a lot, doesn't mean that there's a lot of water. The water gets right back into the system very quickly, and it has to support not just the growing communities in Western Washington, but also, I think, reviving and trying to bring back our salmon to once they were. I think we'll find that continue to be a challenge. I mean, even this community here in the Olympia, Tumwater, Lacey areas, it has grown tremendously over the last 20 years, and will continue, I would imagine.
So just because it's wet, just because it rains, doesn't necessarily correlate to ample water supply.
Absolutely not. No.
And I want to ask you just a couple last things. One is about there was a very sort of notorious Supreme Court decision around people drilling their own wells that became quite a political hot potato here in the legislature several years ago. And then you were reminding me that we had first met, I think, in the context of a moratorium on new wells in the Kittitas area. So that's an addition. We also have a housing shortage in this state of 1 million+ units, and you can't build a house unless you have a water supply. So when you think about the growth of this state, the housing needs of the state, and this increasing pressure on our limited water supply, what's the path forward there?
Well, that's exactly the conundrum you've just described is what we're feeling and experiencing, I think, throughout the state. We're seeing that not only in the housing crisis, but also even in eastern central Washington, where we have to create farm worker housing that was once reliant on domestic wells, but because of how the municipal water law is now being interpreted, they need a water right now. So we're being challenged. We're actually, this is an issue that's front and center right now for the department as they try to address modern farm worker housing and the requirements of farm worker housing with the needs for water supply. So I think what we'll find is those who have water for whatever purpose, beneficial use, those conversations need to start happening with the growth, where that growth needs to occur, how that growth will occur, and where, and how, and who has the water in those areas that we can work with, and what's in it for them, and trying to find those solutions will be, I think, the challenge that the state will face.
And just lastly, if, with the benefit of the 30 years at Ecology in your long career, and the fact that you're now retired, if you had the ear of every local and state and federal policymaker who's thinking about these issues, what would you say about what's needed in terms of infrastructure investment, in terms of what it's going to require to stay ahead of the climate impacts? What advice, counsel, what imperative do you think is before them?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think most imperatively is to have local legislators understand their water needs in their districts. And water sometimes can be a very challenging political topic. What I would like and what I would hope is that, and we do have some very strong legislators that are very knowledgeable on water, but that we broaden that, not just.
Maybe they need a water caucus.
Maybe they do.
Maybe they have one, and I don't know about
Yeah, it would be an excellent idea. And I think those are the kinds of things where we would pay the attention to this resource that we are all so dependent upon in a manner that will allow us to grow smart, efficiently, and responsibly.
And what's your advice to your colleagues for those coming up kind of in your footsteps at Department of Ecology?
Great people, challenging work, noble work, important work, and stay the course. Be willing to meet with people on their ground, in their neighborhoods, in their communities, understand their issues. Be willing to try to work to solve problems. They are, in some cases, very challenging problems, but they're not intractable. They can be solved, and I think that would be my message.
A bit of art and science to
Correct.
managing water. Tom Tebb, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service to the state and for reflecting on it and coming out of retirement to chat with us.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very
now
much.
back to regular programming.
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. When we return, for the third year in a row, Washington is facing drought conditions in several counties. We walk through this with the state's lead person on drought, back right after this.
It really is an honor for the Sun Dome to be the host of the largest piece of public art.
circle of light makes the building come alive. It really makes the building sing.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Believe it or not, several parts of Washington on both sides of the Cascade Mountains once again face drought conditions this year. This is the third year in a row that Washington has declared a drought emergency in some areas. Joining me now to discuss the current conditions and the long-term challenges that are likely to make drought more common in our state is the state's drought lead, Caroline Mellor of the Department of Ecology. Thanks for being here. Good to see you.
Thank you for the time.
So this is increasingly common. It's 6 times over the last decade, 3 times in the last 3 years. Droughts have been announced. Drought conditions have taken hold. What is the trend line? What are you noticing? What is your team noticing? Where are we headed here?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so in terms of these immediate frequencies and immediate trends, we have seen droughts being more common in Washington for the Yakima Basin watersheds. The 3 watersheds that make up the Yakima Basin are those that are in the new drought emergency declaration the state issued on April 8th. And then we have additional areas in the west side as well as over in the Mettow and Okanagan that are under a drought advisory status, which means that they have not yet met our state thresholds for drought conditions, but are very concerning and on the edge in areas we're watching extra closely.
So what's leading to this? When you look at the data and the conditions, what tips something into a drought emergency or a drought advisory?
So in Washington state, we have drought conditions defined in state law. There are 2 thresholds. First, the water supply is less than 75% of normal. And when I talk about normal, that's referring to the 30-year average from 1991 to 2020. And when I talk about water supply, there's a range of different factors that make up water supply. But water supply is really important to highlight because when we talk about drought, we're not just talking about dryness, we're talking about the water supply in rivers and streams to serve fish farms and people.
And how much is that based on the water in the streams and rivers now versus the amount of snowpack, to go back to what Tom Tebb was saying in the first half, talking about snowpack, which is sort of our reservoir system, and it'll start to melt and then it sort of feeds the rivers and streams.
Yeah, exactly. So to back up for a second, so folks who live on the west side may often think that it rains here often, we never have to worry about drought. However, again, when we think about drought, talking about water supply changes the picture, and that's why snowpack is so important. And so in a normal year, snowpack serves as natural storage, where it would gradually melt throughout spring and summer to make water available in streams. However, in these years where we see what we call a snowpack drought, and we have these warmer winters, then precipitation comes down as rain instead of snow or melts away off too early, affecting water supply for folks in our critical April through September period.
So is that when you all made this declaration earlier this month, was it based on looking primarily at snowpack?
There were a couple of factors. Snowpack was one of them, and also with having these droughts in 23 and 24, we saw compounding deficits in snowpack and precipitation, particularly in the Yakima Basin watersheds. And then the second big factor for the drought declaration released this April, for the Yakima Basin watersheds, they're also affected by the reservoir storage and the reservoirs run by the Bureau of Reclamation. And reservoir storage, earlier this April, Reclamation said it was 5th lowest since 1971.
Ooh, wow. And
then Reclamation also calculates how much water is available to folks that have a specific type of water right called pro-ratable. And they announced just last week that there only would be 54% of their water allotment available for folks with that type of water right.
So what are the implications here? And so the Yakima Basin, the 3 counties there, remind us of the 3 counties that are implicated?
Yakima, Kittitas, and Benton.
And in that area, I mean, the Yakima Basin as a whole is home to $4.5 billion in agricultural-related economy, and again, highly affected here. What are the implications, both in terms of when you declare a drought, what is the message that's being sent, but also what are the resources that are made available?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of impacts, we expect impacts this year, particularly in the Yakima Basin for agriculture. As you referenced, there's a lot of revenue that comes out of that basin, but also impacts food for the rest of the state and other areas as well. There are major crops like hops, apples, cherries, wine grapes, as well as a huge part of our economy. But then in addition to agriculture, there are also impacts to fish in terms of the overall system of rivers and streams in the agricultural area. We know fish is also really important both to tribes and to the economy and to the ecosystem. And then other potential impacts we may see, particularly in rural areas of the state, there are still places that, for small public water drinking systems that depend on surface water. And those impacts will be to be determined later in the year, in the summer. And then in terms of the second part of your question.
And let me just, before you answer the second part, are we in a situation where farmers or more junior water right holders are going to be told, likely, you don't have water available to irrigate, for instance?
For junior water right holders, absolutely yes. There will be less or none available for junior water right holders. So we actually already have farmers in the Yakima Basin that have started fallowing crops. And I've seen photos from irrigators in the Yakima Basin of piles of apple trees that will not be watered this year. And then that will affect their impact crops and for next year as well.
Wow. Is there water banking in that area? Is that a thing? Is that available?
That is a thing, and that actually directly relates to some of the relief options available.
Okay. So part B was, what about if you declare a drought, what does that free up in terms of resources?
Yeah, so in the state of Washington, when we declare drought, that means two specific things. It means that first, ecology can expedite processing of water transfer applications and drought permits. And that relates to the question about water banks, as one thing that irrigators will do is that they will apply from us to transfer water, and that will allow them to use water from a water bank or another irrigation district who's choosing to fallow crops, and then transfer that water to an irrigation district who might have this proratable water right, where they're only going to get about half of their use of their normal water.
And this creates a system where, again, we were talking about in the first half, senior water right holders. They can participate in this and not actually lose their water right. It's more of a temporary loan, if you will, right?
Yes, only a temporary transfer of water
yeah.
rights.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that happens when we declare drought is it triggers additional or specific drought response grant funding, where it opens up specific funding for emergency drought response that otherwise is unavailable. And that's a great part of our statute, and we really appreciate the legislators' support for that drought emergency response funding.
What is some of that funding? What is that funding by, and how, is it enough money to really make a dent?
And so that funding allows public entities, for instance, irrigation districts or conservation district, cities, counties, and tribes to support work they're doing, and that can involve leasing of water, or in past years, we have supported small utilities to truck water in emergency water situations.
And that would be for municipal water use?
Yes.
Oh.
And that happened in 2023, actually over on the Olympic Peninsula, where there is a small water system that still is dependent on a surface water stream.
We're in a budget crisis in this state. What is the availability of resources for these sort of emergency measures?
Yeah, so thankfully the legislators set it up in a past session where upon the issuance of a drought declaration, then that triggers up to $3 million to be transferred to the drought response account. And so thankfully then we are not impacted by the current budget issues specifically for drought emergency response funds.
How would you view the $3 million? Is that a drop in the bucket, so to speak, in terms of the need?
And I would say for emergency response, it does make a difference, particularly for irrigation districts and small, public entities, whether small cities or small utilities across the state. However, when we talk about need, as Tom is also referencing, it's important to think about not just the emergency response, but the longer-term need for drought preparedness and drought resiliency. I think you mentioned earlier the longer-term picture. And so I would say that longer term, that there will be a future need to think about drought preparedness and drought resiliency beyond the drought emergency response funds.
Let's transfer to these counties now that have the drought, not declaration, but the sort of advisory or warning, and they are parts of Pierce, King, Snohomish, and Skagit, all on the west side, as well as Okanagan, Chelan, and Whatcom counties, and Whatcom, of course, on the west side. What does that tell us that there are counties west of the Cascades, on the west side of the Cascades, that are also facing potential shortages or drought conditions?
Yeah, and this goes back to the importance of snowpack. And those areas are actually seeing lower snowpack this year than most of the Yakima Basin. And that snowpack, again, serves as that natural storage, like Tom referenced. And then with having lower than normal snowpack, some basins have seen 68%, 65% in those counties that you mentioned. And so with those ones, we're watching extra closely. There's the potential that they may be brought into the declarations as conditions evolve. And then in terms of impacts, there may be impacts on small agriculture, for fish, as well as smaller public entities. I will highlight in terms of the areas served by the utilities of Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma. Those three specifically have large reservoirs and were able to manage proactively for lower than normal snowpack earlier on this year.
So they held back more water, kept more in their reservoirs. They should be okay at this point.
Yes, they do not expect any issues.
But other parts of those same counties that they serve, it's not the case. There will be impacts.
There is the sort of potential for impacts. They're sort of on that edge of our areas of concern, and that's why you put them in that drought advisory status. And then I'll highlight a second usefulness of that drought advisory is for smaller public entities who have less capacity to plan, highlighting those conditions a little earlier on before they're potentially in a full emergency, helps smaller public entities to potentially reach out, and then we can help them think about what a project would look like if they were to be under a drought declaration.
Okay, let's start to put some of this in context. 3 years in a row of drought declarations in this state. 6 of the last 10 years we've had drought conditions. How is this year looking in comparison to past years, both in terms of the geography affected, the number of counties implicated, the severity of the situation? Is it sort of like an up and down, or are we steadily sort of seeing a worsening with each of these successive drought years?
Each of these last 3 drought years of 23, 24, now 2025, have been a little bit different. In 2023, the drought was really driven by that very hot May that we had in 2023. And then in 2024, it was driven by snowpack. And now we've got these multiple factors compounding this year. I will say last year we had a worse snowpack at this point in time. And while this year we've got some concerning levels of snowpack across different parts of the state, we're now seeing a lot of these impacts of multiple years of drought in a row. And then thinking about the future, studies show that we can expect in Washington to have these snowpack droughts about 40% of the years going forward. However, we're already seeing those frequencies coming true looking at the 6 out of 10 droughts we've seen.
So what is that, how are you all at Ecology thinking about sort of long-term strategies and how you adjust to sort of maybe a more permanent new normal here?
Yeah, great question. So one thing in ecology is ecology led with other state agencies as well, the creation of the State Climate Resilience Plan, which looks at a wide range of different climate impacts, and drought is a major focus of that. And I highlight that as a great example of interagency efforts, and it's also an ongoing effort that's going to be updated periodically, both with conditions and new actions. And it also identifies specific actions that the state can take to increase our climate resiliency. And then in terms of drought, going back to drought preparedness and resilience, that's where we really encourage folks, either just members of the public or those that are associated with water managers, whether utilities or irrigators, to be thinking about these conditions not just as one-off situations, but part of our new normal here in Washington.
And especially on the west side of the Cascades, when, I think psychologically it's hard to understand this and to sort of get one's head around it because it does rain so much and we have to, survive the gloom of the winter months. And then, we're so appreciative of a little sunshine, which seems to arrive around this time of year. And then to have somebody saying, oh, by the way, you live in a drought area or a drought risk area, it just doesn't compute.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that's why I encourage folks to think about water supply and drought, not just about the amount of water, but water in rivers and streams. And again, when folks on these clear days look up to the Cascades, we say the mountain is out. I remind folks that that snowpack is so important for our water availability. And if you either have a warm winter here in the west side where a lot of folks live, I would encourage folks to think about, a warm winter could mean we're not building snowpack up in the mountains. If I go up there skiing, what's happening in the snowpack and how that could impact water come late spring, summer, early fall.
It's also super noticeable in the Olympics, at least, by the late summer, at least from sea level, you can't see any snow up there anymore. And I think I'm remembering correctly that it used to be that you would have some snowpack sort of survive, at least growing up here. But my sense is that there's much less visible snow blanketing the Olympics by late summer.
Yeah, that is true. And we're seeing a lot of these impacts. We also have a hotter summer, and then that leads to
More
earlier
melt.
melt off.
Yeah.
Exactly. Especially for that August, September time, that can really be important for irrigators and fish.
How do you balance in sort of this emergency drought relief climate that we're in, situation we're in, the need to protect ecosystems like the fish habitats and the stream flows, and then also you're thinking about drinking water supply for residences and the needs of farmers?
Yeah, and so I will highlight that when folks apply for an emergency water right transfer, while the only thing that's different is how fast ecology can expedite that, all the other requirements, including something we called mitigation, are still in place, which is to say compliance is still there, how we do permitting is still there, that what we do in terms of drought relief is not going to be something that we otherwise wouldn't do in terms of protecting in-stream flows. In Washington, a number of basins have what we call in-stream rules that protect flows, meaning that we're not going to permit something that would affect a flow at a certain level.
You talked about the the term adaptation. What would you say about sort of our need to adapt to changing climate and adapt our water management? What is the sort of reality check? And I this is along the lines of what I asked Tebb too. As we continue to have this more frequent drought conditions, how do we need to continue to start adapting to this new reality?
Yeah, and adaptation is going to be the key. So it's not just that every year we're looking to respond in the moment, that we've thought about what adaptation and resilience looks like. And just echoing what Tom said, it's going to be a variety of solutions. There may be some places where increased storage is the answer, and that may be above ground, that may be below ground. It's going to be thinking about how different interests can work together. The Yakima Basin is a great example of a basin that has an ongoing partnership group that brings all the interests together at the table. And I think that collaboration example is going to be really key in the future of continuing to get multiple interests together at the table to talk about the nuances and where we can find options to work together.
And just lastly, we've talked on this program about the role of tribes and their treaties. There's also an effort in this state, especially under the HEAL Act, to just reach historically marginalized communities, to bring historically marginalized voices to the table. What does that start to look like when you're doing this work around a shortage of water and drought?
Yeah, really appreciate that question. And so even though water law itself is pretty restrictive of what we can do, I think one real opportunity is how we do our grant programs. We do a lot of grants in water resources. We have our stream flow restoration program, as well as our drought grants. So we have an opportunity to think about how we provide technical assistance and support to the communities that have overburdened communities and vulnerable populations, and to make sure that we're providing the best support we can, particularly those in rural areas where the local cities, small towns might have less capacity, to help make sure we're serving them as best we can.
And just lastly, what's your message to the everyday water user about how they should be using water, especially if they live in an area that's affected by one of these drought, either warnings, advisories, or actual drought emergencies?
I would say thinking about, again, these patterns being more part of our everyday normal. Gardening is still a great thing to do. However, thinking about drought-tolerant plants and those that use less water and more low water use practices. Tom mentioned drip irrigation for irrigators. That can also be a practice that the everyday gardener uses for their garden.
And I suppose you could even do that for your lawn.
Exactly.
Okay. Caroline Mellor, thank you very much for talking with us, State's Drought Lead. Not sure you were here the bearer of good news, but at least you're giving us a reality check so we know what we're getting into. So thank you.
Great.
Appreciate
Thank you
it.
very much.
Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.